Hello, History 362. So today, as we sort of close out our week of thinking about kings and cities, I want to talk a little bit about the basic problem that cities have. They're just too darn small vis-a-vis the power of the Hellenistic kingdoms. And what strategies are there for cities to get bigger, to go bigger? And one problem with the city-state model in the ancient world is it's actually really hard to go bigger. It becomes harder and harder to act like a city-state where everyone comes together to a central nucleated urban core to engage in politics and society and culture and trade and all of the things that make city-states such dynamic entities. But the bigger and bigger a city-state gets, the harder it is to have only one center. And indeed, city-states therefore tend to, there's a limit really, a practical limit to the size. This limit is acknowledged by ancient theoreticians. For Aristotle, the ideal size of a city-state is about 5,000 citizens. That's not very big. Athens, at its peak, may have 50 or 60,000 adult male citizens, and once you factor in women, children, and enslaved persons, it may be closer to 250,000. Athens is one of the largest Greek city-states. But even that is pretty much a max, and indeed Athens, by the time we get to the 4th century, the end of the 4th century, probably has about 20,000 adult male citizens. So a much smaller population from Athens at its 5th century peak. So nonetheless, cities do explore a number of strategies for trying to plus themselves up. Oftentimes this is done as they position themselves in a geopolitical world that is now defined by these really big players. Now, the most basic way that a Greek city-state can plus itself up is a merger. Take another nearby neighboring city-state, and rather than being two separate entities, simply merge into one. And this is called Synoicism. Sometimes the process is also referred to as Synoicism, although usually Synoicism refers to the merger of sub-polis entities, sub-city-state entities. So villages coming together to form a polis, which happens a number of times in Greek history. That would be a Synoicism. Usually when it's two polises that have a defined citizenry, and actually usually they're two defined centers, when those come together to form a single new polis, or oftentimes one is simply absorbed into the other, that's called Synopolytea. So that's one way to get bigger. And usually it involves, again, a somewhat larger, more prestigious city simply absorbing the citizen body of a neighboring city so that they now have more territory, more tax base, more ability to do military recruitment. So Synopolytea, you take two cities, you smash them together, and now you've got a new, bigger city. Now, also what you can do is, rather than a merger, you can kind of have something called a shared citizenship, and this is called Isopolytea. So rather than sort of one city glomming into another, the two cities retain their separate identities, but the citizens of one city are given the two cities, I guess, more likely, reciprocally give each other's citizens the rights that their citizens have. So that means the city, it's easy for the citizens to move back and forth in between the two cities, to own land in the other city, to have the same privileges in one city as in another. So Isopolytea, on one hand, kind of prevents the civic. It prevents the problem of one city that has its own kind of cherished laws and heritage, and now it's just gone. It's just subsumed. Isopolytea, both cities get to keep their identities, but it now forms they now have a kind of meta identity as they have shared citizen rights. And so in this way, they can cities that practice Isopolytea can get bigger, but not feel like they're losing something or giving something up, which usually the junior partner in a Synoicism does. So Isopolytea, again, a shared citizenship, is another way to allow a city to get bigger. That being said, not that much bigger, right? Even the Hellenistic kingdom like Ptolemaic Egypt or the Seleucid Empire is huge, and there's no way that simply taking two small city-states and either smashing them together or creating a kind of shared citizen space in Isopolytea, there's no way that that's going to allow that new city to in any way approach the power of any of the Hellenistic kings. Now, a option, in fact, this option really is what works the best, is for cities to form leagues. That is federalism. And this is actually most effective in Greece, where there are two federal leagues that actually get to be regional players and are competitive with the power of the Antigonid kings. This is actually a case where a league of cities, pooling their resources, can actually challenge a Hellenistic king, although admittedly the king of Macedonia is the weakest of the three big Hellenistic kings. So a league in Greece is called a Coinon, common thing, plural koina. And a Coinon, we oftentimes use the term federal league. A Coinon sees a group of cities. They all retain their local identity, their internal identity, and their internal politics. They elect, they have their internal assemblies, their internal councils, their internal magistrates. But then they establish a league. That league has its own magistrates, oftentimes generals, strategoi. It has its own assembly where people from all of the cities can come and vote in the federal assembly to make federal policy. And there's a sort of established set things that the Coinon does that the cities don't. So common things are a military policy, which makes sense if you actually need to have a joint army commanded by usually a elected strategos. And also oftentimes things like weights and measures, coinage, making sure that, that there's a kind of economic zone between these shared cities. So you can go in the market in one city and the weights and measures are the same as they were in your home city. And the coinage is meant to, the cities may still be minting their own coinage, but they're doing it on the same weights and standards. So when you pull out a silver drachma, it weighs the same anywhere within your league. And so that has an economic value in addition to a kind of military or strategic value of pooling the resources of the cities to have a federal foreign policy. So the two big leagues that will be that are in the Hellenistic world are the Aetolian League. The Aetolians actually are already kind of on the map in the early 3rd century. They're the ones who help stop the Gallic assault against Delphi. It's an Aetolian army that ultimately fends that off. And so that kind of marks the arrival of the Aetolian League in international politics. And now the Aetolians, this federal league, can claim a Gallic victory to, again, place them alongside these other Hellenistic kings claiming Gallic victories. And indeed, the Aetolians mint a coin that show a goddess sitting on a pile of Celtic shields. The other important league, bitter rivals to the Aetolians, are the Achaeans, who are based in the northern Peloponnese. And these, the Achaeans kind of really come together a little later. There may have been a weaker Achaean league, but the Achaean league is turned into actually a formidable player by Aratus of Sicyon in the middle of the 3rd century BC. We'll talk more about the specific events that take place when we look at the dynamics of Antigonid Macedonia in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. But suffice to say, we have the Aetolians, the Achaeans, and these again are because of the way that they pool the resources of the, in many instances, smaller cities of Achaea and Aetolia, are able to actually be big players on the sort of broader world of Hellenistic geopolitics. So the Coinon is a very effective way for cities to come together, get bigger, and therefore still be able to throw their weight around. There is actually an additional option, although you might say it's a little weirder, and that is act like kingdoms. And we do have a number of cities where they are subject to monarchic rule, and their kings try to act like Hellenistic kings. So one place where this happens is actually Sparta. Sparta is already a weird Greek city-state. For those of you who took classical Greek history with me, Sparta has these weird kings, two of them, who rule together. One thing that happens in the Hellenistic world is one dynasty goes extinct, and the remaining Hellenistic kings of Sparta, in their coinage and self-presentation, seem to increasingly present themselves in a manner similar to how the Hellenistic kings represent themselves on their coins. And of course, the fact that there's now only one Spartan king makes it possible for those kings to try, not all are able to do this, but some try and a few briefly succeed. We'll talk more about the specifics later on in the course, but to sort of try to rule like Hellenistic kings. And so Sparta is a place that is a city-state that nonetheless has a king who starts maybe thinking as if he's kind of the ambitions and presentation of a Hellenistic king. Another place where this happens is Syracuse. Now, Syracuse is again a big city in western in the west, it's actually on the eastern coast of Sicily, but in the Magna Graeca. And Syracuse has variously had a democracy alternating with tyrants who can come to power. But the tyrants of Syracuse increasingly start ruling and presenting themselves as Hellenistic kings. And so Sicily is another city-state that its way of kind of, if not going big, at least going bold, is to have kings who then seek to impose their military control over what they're able to control, which in this case is a part of eastern Sicily. Another place where this happens is Pergamon. And indeed, Pergamon is interesting because it is a city ruled by a dynast that actually succeeds in transitioning into a much larger territorial Hellenistic kingdom. So Pergamon in the 280s is ruled by a guy named Philotirus, and in the chaos that follows the death of Seleucus I Nicator, he basically starts governing Pergamon. He goes from being kind of a petty Seleucid official who acknowledges the direct authority of the Seleucid kings to basically being an independent agent, an independent dynast who governs, acknowledges the suzerainty of the Seleucid kings, but governs very much as his own agent. By the 240s, his descendants, he's actually a eunuch, but people who are his relatives, they start calling themselves king, Basileus. They adopt the title of Basileus, probably when another spasm of political uncertainty hits the Seleucid Empire in the 240s. And so, especially, this is ruled by a guy named Attalus II. These are the Attalid kings of Pergamon. But really, they don't control much more than the small territory around the city-state of Pergamon, on a beautiful high citadel. They will, nonetheless, with Roman help, eventually come into a large kingdom that encompasses big chunks of Western Asia Minor. So another instance of a city-state with a monarchic figure who has the ambitions and presentations of a Hellenistic king, and this succeeds in allowing that city-state to turn into a modest size territorial kingdom. Again, all of these places, Syracuse, Sparta, Pergamon, they're kind of exceptions. They're kind of weird exceptions. But you might say that that is the sort of blurring of a kingdom and a city-state is a potential solution, even if it has mixed results. There is one city-state that is weird in that it is a real throwback city-state, a city-state that is a democracy and that maintains its considerable power and influence as a democracy with a navy. Remember, in classical Greece, navies and democracies are very closely entwined because of the need for the demos to row the ships. And that is Rhodes. Now, Rhodes is an island off now the coast of Turkey. It's strategically located in the Aegean, and the Rhodians have an excellent navy. They devote a huge amount of money and the resources, the manpower resources of their citizen body to maintaining an unusually large and well-trained fleet. And this makes them, for a city-state, again, on an island, the population potential of Rhodes is limited by the fact that it's surrounded by ocean. There's not that much more land. But because they invest institutionally in a really excellent citizen navy, this allows Rhodes to be a strategically oriented and militarily potent city-state. Now, they still need to triangulate, and in particular, the Rhodians rely on a long-standing friendly relationship with the Ptolemies. But Rhodes is a valuable friend, and a friend that can operate with Ptolemaic kings with a degree of equality because they've invested so much effort in this really good fleet. And so again, Rhodes is kind of an exception. It's a throwback, a democratic city-state that is an important geopolitical agent in its own right, simply by running a democratic institution, a military institution, the Navy, really, really well. So at the end of the day, many of these strategies see mixed results. And indeed, some of these strategies can actually be used by kings to control cities. If there's a king who wants to, say, punish a small city, sometimes it might impose a Synoicism with it. Say, well, guess what? We're going to merge you into another city that I'm more friendly with, and that's going to be the end of your city. It's just going to be absorbed by another city. Kings at times are more than happy to sponsor leagues of cities, Coinon, because it's actually a way of organizing those cities so that the king, rather than having to interface with one single city, can simply interface with the League. We saw how Philip II did this with the League of Corinth. Both the Ptolemies and the Antigonids will sponsor a league of island cities in the Aegean called the Nesiotic League. And again, this means that they now have one point to interact with all of these cities that are on little islands, on mostly the Cycladic islands. So oddly, the way that the strategies that cities have to kind of go big vis-a-vis these big Hellenistic kingdoms are sometimes hijacked by the kings themselves, who turn the tables and use those techniques to control cities by forcing Synoicism or by incorporating them into leagues that are then in turn tools of royal control. Now there is one irony. Maybe I'll close on this irony. Of course, I know some of you are also taking my Roman Republic class, 363. And that is the power that eventually comes and takes a geopolitical wrecking ball to this world is a city-state. It is Rome. What is notable is that the Romans, what makes them exceptional, I mean, Rome is a weird power, but it's a city-state that actually finds a way to go big and does it better than any Greek city-state ever does. It incorporates a huge citizen body by incorporating various Italian peoples, and then it uses that large citizen body to man huge armies that conquer the Mediterranean. But some of the techniques that Rome uses, and uses with more verve, have some parallels with what the Greeks are doing. The Romans essentially forced Synoicism by conquering other cities in Italy and then forcibly incorporating them into the bigger city of Rome, whether it's Tusculum or Latin communities. At some point, they revolt, and the Romans say, "Well, that's it. You're all Roman now." They practice a form of Isopolytea, or that what the Greeks would recognize as Isopolytea, or Greek writers call Isopolytea, in that Latin colonies are given the same rights as Roman citizens, a sort of idea of reciprocal citizenship. This actually allows the Romans to send out, to help to colonize Italy and have a network of colonies that are loyal to Rome. So ironically, the cities are experimenting, Greek cities are experimenting with going bigger, and maybe at most are modestly successful. They get wiped out ultimately, or the whole Hellenistic world gets wiped out by a city-state that kind of masters how to go bigger, albeit not a Greek city-state. So at any rate, those are just some thoughts. Suffice it to say, we are now in a world where kings and cities are negotiating an ongoing coexistence. We will continue to explore that world into next week. I'll see you then.